Story 1. I was 19 when it all started. The time when you still think that adulthood is something far ahead, but you are already beginning to understand that the world is not at all like you imagined it as a child. I lived in a small farming town in northern Colorado, the kind of place you wouldn't even notice if you drove by. The town was surrounded by fields, and there was not much life here. Some people worked on the farm, some went to the nearest city to shop. It was quiet here, especially at night, when the farmers returned home and only occasionally could you hear a gunshot go off in the fields. But those who lived there were used to the silence. One night I was walking with my friend Larry. We were about the same age. He was a bit of an odd guy, but we got along well. Larry always looked at the world with humor, and even the most ordinary things could make him laugh. So, that night we were walking along the main road of the city, but closer to the outskirts. I knew that the nearest intersection was not that far away, and we walked up to it, continuing to chat and laugh. Everything was as usual until we heard a strange sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe someone left the radio on in the car. But no, it was a steady, continuous sound, like a moo. It was repeated every 3 seconds, like a cow saying something, but there was something strange in the air. It was not like the usual sound you hear in the countryside. It was something different, unnatural. I turned around and looked at Larry, who also stopped, frowning. We both stood there, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. I felt a little uneasy, but I decided not to show it to my friend. To ease the tension, I jokingly shouted, "Yes, that is Skinwalker." Larry laughed and seemed to calm down, but at that moment the mooing became louder and did not stop. It sounded stronger and more insistent. We stopped and listened. At first it seemed like it was just coming from the other end of the street, but now it seemed to be much closer. We froze and looked at each other, not knowing what to do. Suddenly we heard another sound. The snapping of a branch. It was so loud that I felt a shiver run down my spine. We looked at each other and decided to go back to my house. But as soon as we took a step back, the sound stopped again. Everything was quiet, but I continued to feel uneasy, as if we were not alone. I could not understand why, but I felt very uneasy. We walked in silence, but every step I took seemed loud. The thought did not stop in my head. What was that? When we got back to the house, I invited Larry to stay the night. I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt like I didn't want to be alone. Something inside me told me that it wasn't just a random noise. When we got inside, I tried to calm down, but at that moment I could feel the cold wind coming through the window. Larry was chatting away as usual, but I didn't care. My thoughts were occupied only with that strange sound. Every few seconds I noticed any noises around me, the rustling sounds that seemed a little too loud, and the silence of the night, which now seemed unsettling to me. That evening seemed to go on forever. Larry and I continued to talk, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. Every time I closed my eyes, I seemed to hear that sound again, and it was getting closer. Larry and I laughed, but I felt anxiety creeping up on me. That strange evening was something new for me. I had never been so sensitive to sounds as I was at that moment. We finished the evening and Larry went home, but I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed trying to figure out what it was, but I couldn't find a logical explanation. The sounds became stranger, and the silence of the night became more threatening. The next morning I thought it was all just a figment of my imagination, that perhaps I was tired and started hearing things that weren't there. But when I went outside, I felt the air become heavy. The feeling that something invisible was hanging in the air didn't leave me. I often walked along the same streets, and even in the daytime I felt uneasy. I always felt like someone was watching me, but the strange events didn't stop. They started repeating themselves over and over again. All those noises, the crunching of branches and that strange mooing. Each time I felt more and more wary. I didn't know what those sounds were or why they were so frequent. Thoughts were swarming in my head that I couldn't control. None of this seemed normal, and unfortunately, with each passing day it was becoming more and more difficult to forget what had happened. From that moment on, I began to avoid the dark corners of the city. I knew something was wrong. That evening, when I heard the mooing and felt something lurking in the darkness, was a turning point for me. And although I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, I increasingly realized that perhaps I had encountered something beyond my understanding. With each passing day, the strange sounds became more frequent, and the feeling that something was wrong did not leave me. A few days after that night, when Larry and I heard the mysterious mooing, it became clear to me that it was not an accident. The sounds I heard became more and more varied. Sometimes they were strange, unclear rustling sounds. At other times, a light crunch, as if someone was walking on dry branches. All this happened as if on the border of perception, not giving me an exact answer to the question, what is it? I began to feel that every step, every movement on the streets, every glance into the darkness became something dangerous. Something invisible that had been with me all this time began to come alive in my head. I tried to distract myself, to do ordinary things, meet with friends, watch TV, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave me. Every time I went outside or just looked out the window, it seemed to me that I was not alone. Sometimes I even had to look back several times trying to understand who or what could be watching me. I kept talking to Larry, but he didn't take my concerns seriously. He laughed and said maybe it was just stress. I wasn't sure. I was scared, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. All I knew was that I wasn't alone. Someone or something was watching me, lurking in the shadows. One night, Larry invited me out and around town. He still didn't take my concerns seriously, but I knew something was going to happen. This time I felt especially uneasy as we walked past fields and empty houses. The wind was cold and sharp, and there was a tension in it. Larry and I came to an intersection near the same place where we had heard the strange mooing the first night. It was quiet again, almost eerily still. Larry was saying something, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. My eyes darted around the dark corners as if I was waiting for something to slip out. And then, as we were walking down the street, there was that sound again, the mooing. It wasn't just like the last time, when we heard it in the distance. No, this time the sound was much closer, almost at the very edge of our attention. It didn't repeat itself every 3 seconds like before. It was intermittent, drawn out, as if it were trying to say something. Larry didn't even notice. He kept on chatting as usual and didn't look around. I froze, listening. The humming was getting louder, as if someone was standing very close. Larry said something, but I couldn't focus on his words. I turned around and saw a faint light coming from one of the dark corners of the building, faint, but bright enough that I knew something was connected to the sound. I didn't know what, but I felt everything inside me tense, as if every moment was on the brink of something. I returned to my house faster than usual, not wanting to continue my walk. Larry didn't even understand why I was in such a hurry. He asked what was wrong with me, but I told him I was just tired. He didn't ask any more questions, and we parted ways. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something very strange had happened, and that this sound was connected to something unknown, hidden in the dark corners of my city. I tried not to think about it, but the more I tried to let these thoughts go, the more they haunted me. The night brought no peace. I couldn't sleep again. Those strange sounds kept playing in my head, and every time I closed my eyes, I seemed to hear them again. When I tried to turn over or take a deep breath to calm myself, those sounds became more and more distinct. I tried to push them away, but they wouldn't go away. My thought kept nagging at me. If all this is true, if I really hear them, then there must be something. And that something is watching. A few days later, I felt the need to talk to Larry again. He was the only person I could confide in about this situation, but I was hesitant to tell him all my experiences. I wasn't sure he would take it seriously since he wasn't as impressionable as I was. However, I knew I needed to share this with someone. We met and I told him again about what had happened and how it was bothering me. Larry laughed, but there was a strange shadow in his eyes. He still suggested that we go to that street again at night to see if it really could be just a random sound. We decided to meet late that evening, and when night fell, we stepped into the darkness again. When we got to that spot, I immediately felt something was wrong. There was silence in the air, and across the street I saw a figure. It was standing in the shadows, its silhouette barely visible. Larry didn't notice anything strange, but I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong here, and I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. That night I realized that the hidden, dark presence I felt was not imaginary. It was real, and I didn't know what I was about to face. Several days passed, but the feeling of unease did not leave me. Everything that had happened in these last weeks had become more and more unclear and disturbing. The mooing that Larry and I had heard that first night was not an isolated incident. Now it had become part of my life, as if something inevitable. I began to notice that strange sounds were repeated as soon as night fell, as soon as the city was plunged into darkness. Sometimes it was a mooing, sometimes the snap of a twig or a light scraping, as if someone was quietly walking down the street. All these sounds were in the shadows, somewhere far away, but always so close that I could feel them in my body. Many would think it was just a coincidence or a figment of my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. Every night when I tried to close my eyes, I felt that sound creeping into my thoughts. I couldn't forget it. I became more sensitive to everything that was happening around me, as if everything I heard was connected to something sinister lurking in the shadows. At some point, I decided that I couldn't stay in this house any longer. I had to find a way to understand what was going on. However, no matter how stupid it seemed, I couldn't continue living in this constant anxiety. I thought that maybe if I stood outside myself and tried to see where the sounds were coming from, I could solve the mystery. One night, I told myself that I had to be prepared for anything. I checked that everything was in order in the house, and then I went outside. The temperature was low and the air was cold. The wind carried with it the smell of freshness that usually only comes at night, when everyone is alone, when the world seems to stop and listen. I walked out onto the road and walked in the direction where I had heard strange noises several times before. My hand clutched my keys nervously, and my heart pounded in my chest, as if I was on the verge of something. I didn't know what exactly, but I felt that something was wrong. Suddenly I saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first it seemed to me that it was just a silhouette of a person, but something about this image was wrong. It was hunched over, tall and crooked, as if its entire silhouette was somehow distorted. I couldn't figure out what it was. I stopped, and a shudder ran through my body. His eyes, two bright, piercing lights, seemed to burn away the darkness. I froze. I couldn't move. I knew something would happen if I didn't hold my breath. It wasn't just a feeling, but some instinctive awareness that this figure was not of our world. I tried to turn back, but as soon as I started moving, I realized that she was watching me. Every step I took was audible in the silence of the night. The sounds grew louder, as if the shadow itself was getting closer. With each step, I felt my heart beat faster and faster, and the fear grew stronger. But as soon as I was distracted for even a second and turned around, I heard the sound again, footsteps approaching my house. I ran towards my house, forgetting about everything in the world. The feeling of panic made me run, but when I looked over my shoulder, I realized that I could not shake the feeling that this shadow was watching my every step. With every breath, I felt it getting closer and closer. I ran to the door, but I could not tear myself away from this gaze that was following me from the darkness. When I returned to the house, I paused for a second at the threshold, still listening to the sound of footsteps disappearing into the silence of the night. I couldn't seem to believe that something or someone was following me. I closed the door and locked it with all the locks, but the feeling that I was not alone did not leave me. I felt the blood freeze in my veins. My head was full of thoughts, but none of them could give me an answer. I knew that something was hiding in this town, and it was waiting for me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I had strange dreams. In each of them, I was in this same city, but the people and things around me were distorted, like in a fog. I tried to understand what it all meant, but in my head there was only one thing: I shouldn't have stayed here. Deep down, I knew that all this was not just an accident. Something had been haunting me for a long time, and I didn't know how to get rid of it. The next morning, I tried to calm down. I even tried to forget about the night, about what had happened. But as soon as I left the house and looked at the dark corners of the street, the same feeling of anxiety came over me. I felt that this shadow would not let me go, and that it was watching my every step. And when I found myself back on the street, I knew it was just the beginning. Several days had passed since I had encountered that strange figure on the street again, and with each passing day, the feeling of fear grew stronger. I could no longer ignore what was happening around me. It seemed that with each passing day, the world became more alien and hostile. The shadows that I had previously been able to perceive as part of the night now became something dangerous, something that hid horror within itself. Larry, my friend, noticed the changes in me. He was not as sensitive to what was happening as I was, but he too began to be bothered by strange events that were becoming more frequent. We were sitting at my house smoking as usual, but this time I could not relax. I felt that I could no longer stay in the house where these sounds haunted me every night, and every corner seemed filled with a shadow ready to jump out and grab me. One day, while Larry and I were walking through the neighborhood, I heard a familiar mooing sound. The sound, which had once been a joke, now became unbearably real. I immediately froze, looking around. Larry noticed my uneasiness and began to listen too. We both stood in the shadows, listening as the sound came again from around the corner, from the dark bushes. It was not loud, rather quiet and rhythmic, but there was something ominous about its repetition. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The moaning continued, but it didn't go away. It was as if it were mocking me, returning each night, creating a growing sense that something was stalking me, that it was close, hidden in the sounds. Larry suggested that we come closer, but I couldn't. I felt that if I took a step in that direction, something terrible would happen. We stood there for a few minutes, and I realized that there was more than just the sounds weighing on me. This world seemed to be falling apart. I felt trapped in some endless nightmare, and even the light of day brought no relief. When we got back to the house, I found that I was not alone again. Someone was standing in the distance, watching us half blindly. Larry did not notice, but I saw his eyes clearly, bright as fire. He was there again, like a shadow hidden in the night, and I felt fear creeping up on me. And again, I did not know what to do. My thoughts became confused. I didn't know who it was, what kind of creature it was, but there was a threat in every look, as if it was watching my every move. I was becoming more and more convinced that this was no accident, and I couldn't just wait any longer. Something had to happen. I knew it. The night Larry and his brother Mitch came to visit me again, I noticed that there was something especially tense in the air this time. We were sitting in the house, having fun, but everything seemed to be in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was ready to jump out and grab me at any moment. And then I heard this noise. It was quiet but distinct, footsteps, scraping lightly across the grass. I froze, turning my head toward the window. And that was when I saw it. It was hunched over again, standing as if watching me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I felt my blood run cold. I couldn't look away, as if this creature was bending me to its will. I froze, not knowing what to do, and it continued to stand there, not moving, its gaze never leaving me. Mitch and Larry were busy, but I couldn't ignore it. I knew that if I didn't grab them and get them away from that window, something terrible would happen. I quickly stood up and told Larry to close the curtains and turn on the music, but I still couldn't shake that feeling. It was still there, waiting for me to do something. That night, we heard a strange rustling in the yard right behind the house. I opened the window and looked out, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Larry wanted to go check, but I held him back. The words didn't come out, simply because I knew that now was not the time for action. I felt that whoever was outside the window was not just some creature, it was someone who knew what I was going to do next. Then I decided not to go back to it. I closed the windows again, checked all the locks, and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I still felt that it wasn't just my paranoia, that something terrible was watching us, and that it would come as soon as we relaxed. I was sure that this fear would not go away, and when I looked back at my house the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden in its shadows, under every corner, around every turn. Every day I felt more and more that I could not escape what was happening. With every step in the night, with every sound, with every glance into the darkness, This horror penetrated my home, my life. More and more often I felt like something invisible was watching me, like a shadow that could not be driven away. I could not forget those strange eyes that looked at me from the darkness. I could not forget that figure standing by the road and the steps that haunted me every night. But what scared me most of all was that this creature was now in my home. Last night, after Larry, Mitch, and I got home, I felt something was wrong. As soon as we walked into the house, I noticed how strangely quiet it was. Usually I could hear noises outside the window, the sound of twigs snapping or footsteps creaking, but it was too quiet, too peaceful. I tried to push the worrying thoughts away and suggested that we all sit down and play cards to take our minds off things. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I noticed the window was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it like that, but perhaps one of us had opened it out of habit. This, of course, may seem insignificant, but at that moment I felt that there was something strange about it, especially when I noticed that there was a light layer of dust on the windowsill, as if someone had just passed by and touched it. I went to the window and looked out, but there was nothing there, only the dark street hidden in the shadows of the night. I closed the window and went back into the room, trying to focus on the conversation with Larry and Mitch, but this feeling wouldn't leave me. At some point, I decided to go outside, even though I knew it could be dangerous. I had to make sure everything was okay, that there was no one around. I told the guys that I was going to take a little walk and check if there was anything strange outside. The moment I left the house and stepped into the night, it seemed to me that I was entering some other world. The silence that reigned around me was almost tangible. I looked around, listening for every sound, but I heard nothing. Time passed, and with every step I took, it became more and more difficult to breathe. I reached the very crossroads where it all began, and stopped, listening. Suddenly I heard it, a slight rustle in the bushes. I frozen in place, and again felt that familiar feeling when every nerve in your body tenses. Footsteps. He was there, behind the trees, where I could not see him, but I knew he was watching. I didn't need any more proof to know that I was right. I ran back to the house, but on my way back I noticed that I could hear those footsteps again. With every step I took, the creature was getting closer. I quickened my steps, trying to get to the house as quickly as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't leave me alone. I was sure that it was already following me, that it knew I was afraid, and that it was enjoying it. When I finally reached the door and ran inside, I felt my breathing become labored. My heart was beating like crazy, and I felt like it refused to slow down. I quickly closed the doors, but the cold night air was still coming in from underneath them. I felt the air getting thicker, as if something of the night was filling the house. At that moment, I realized that something had changed in the house. I didn't know what exactly, but there was an unusual tension in every corner. I closed all the windows, checked the doors, but the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. I wasn't alone in this house. This feeling that something sinister could be lurking around every corner didn't leave me. The walls seemed to be shrinking, as if the whole house had become alive, and this living house was watching me. I tried to calm myself down and explain to myself that it was all just paranoia, that it was all because I was worrying too much, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I felt a sense of being part of something bigger, something that couldn't be explained. I was sure that this house was part of something supernatural. Later, when Larry and Mitch came up to me, they noticed that I was a bit confused. I told them that I felt like something was following me, like it had gotten into the house, but they just laughed and tried to reassure me. But I knew I wasn't wrong. This was all too real to be an accident, and I didn't know how much more I could take before it all got out of hand. A few days had passed since that night incident when I saw him in the bushes and felt like something invisible was watching me. I tried to go about my normal life, as if trying to convince myself that it was all just paranoia, that my feelings were just the result of stress and anxiety, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. Time passed, but this fear didn't go away. It only grew. I started noticing strange things again. First, every morning when I went outside, I would see fresh tracks on the grass near my house, as if someone had wandered around during the night. The tracks were not clear, they were difficult to make out, but they clearly indicated that the creature did not leave me alone. These tracks came from the direction where I had once seen it, where the bushes were, behind which its figure was hidden. But the most disturbing thing was that every night, before I turned out the light, I heard the same footsteps again, the same crunching of grass in the silence of the night, as if someone was moving across the field, approaching me. The footsteps became louder and louder, as if the creature was trying to get into my house. I listened with bated breath, trying to distinguish the sounds, but always closed my eyes, forcing myself to believe that it was just a fantasy. I didn't know why, but I had a feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence, that these weren't just night sounds. I became afraid to go outside again, let alone leave the house. When I needed to go to the store, I always looked back, checking if he was standing somewhere nearby, among the trees or at the edge of the field. This fear gradually began to take hold of me. I felt that he was getting closer, that he was already inside. One night, as I was sitting on the couch watching TV, to my horror, I heard footsteps. They were nearby, not in the field, but right outside the windows. Suddenly, there was a heavy knock, as if someone was knocking hard on the glass. I froze, my heart froze. The moment lasted like an eternity. I didn't know what to do. My feet were as if dug into the floor. The noise continued, and suddenly I saw his eyes. The same eyes I had seen when he had hunched over and watched me from the bushes. They glittered in the darkness, their light shining through the thick curtains. I felt panic rising in me. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed. He was there. He was standing right outside the window, and his gaze was directed straight at me. Suddenly, I felt the air in the room become colder. It was a strange sensation, as if the whole atmosphere was filled with something unnatural. The silence that reigned in the house became unbearable. I reached for my phone, but at that moment I remembered that my phone had no reception. We often lost signal because the house was located in a remote place. It was a real nightmare. I was locked in the house, unable to call for help. I carefully approached the window and looked out, but there was no one there. It seemed so. But as soon as I took a step back, I felt something move behind me. I didn't turn around, but the sound I heard was distinct and clear. It was something, footsteps, as if someone had come very close. With frantic force, I opened the door and ran outside, hoping that this horror would stop, that I could somehow escape from what was chasing me. My head was filled with fear, and I did not know where to run. I remembered that I had once seen my neighbor down the street. He said that he lived in a house that was not far from mine. I ran to his house, hoping that someone nearby could help me. I got to the neighbor's house, knocked on the door, but no one opened. It was too late, and I felt that I did not have enough strength. I returned home, checked all the windows and doors again. When I went inside, I heard someone rustling in the darkness on the second floor. I went upstairs, but the room was empty. This was my final test. I realized that this was not just a vision, not paranoia. The creature was close, and it had come for me. At that moment, I realized that I might never be able to get rid of this fear. I did not know what awaited me, but I was sure of one thing, that from now on I would always look into the darkness, expecting to see those piercing eyes. Story 2. The forest was my salvation. It became my refuge, my own world away from the chaos of the house, full of arguments, shouting, and unplanned fights. All of that was part of my childhood where I couldn't seem to find peace. But the forest was my refuge. It promised peace, quiet, a place where I could forget, at least for a while, from it all. As a child, I often went there, to the trees, where no one could find me. I grew up in the most rural part of the state, where the woods started just outside our backyard and stretched endlessly into the distance. These woods weren't just nature, they were powerful, alive. Sometimes, walking through them, I felt like they were older than everything around me. Their magic was elusive and strange, and I felt like they cared about me, knew what I was going through. The woods weren't just a place, they were alive, and despite their brutal beauty, they welcomed me into their embrace. When I needed to escape my family, their screams, those moments when I didn't belong, I went there. The house I grew up in was not a cozy one. My mom and dad fought constantly, and although on the surface we had everything that most people could only dream of, it didn't feel like a home to me. It was a place where I was more of a witness than a participant. My whole world was full of a cruel atmosphere of conflict and anger, and as a child I would run there, into the woods, trying to find some meaning. My walks became a ritual. Every day returning from school, I wanted to go there. At first, I didn't think about the danger, about some unknown corners that shouldn't be touched. The forest seemed infinitely large, and if you got lost, you could always find your way back. At least that's what it seemed to me. Only with time did I begin to notice oddities. Every year, someone got lost in these woods, and although they almost always returned, their faces when they came back were full of fear. There was something strange, that expression on their faces. I couldn't understand what exactly was causing their fear, but something about this forest was different from other places. However, as a child, I didn't think about possible threats. I simply followed the paths and sought refuge in the shadows of the trees. I felt safe in the forest. There were no strangers' eyes, no judgment, just the silence and peace that I found among the trees. The leaves rustled under my feet. The wind, if there was one, played softly with the branches, and at that moment I forgot that my home was full of screams and pain. I went where my feet led me, and that was my personal liberation. However, as I grew older, the desire to wander further and further into the woods grew stronger. I was curious about what was hidden in those places that no one had visited. On one of these trips I decided to follow a path that I had always avoided. It was an old, barely noticeable path covered in vines and leaves. It looked forgotten, almost abandoned. Usually when I saw it, a feeling of anxiety overwhelmed me. But this time I decided to go. I wanted to understand why this path scared me so much. I knew that danger could await me, but I could not resist my curiosity. I could avoid it, but this time I decided to go. The path was narrow, and although I knew these woods well, everything was different here. Every move I made was suspicious. The leaves on the ground were different than usual. They seemed almost too dry, as if something was burning them. With every step I took, I felt the air getting heavier, and the forest seemed to be closing in around me. My steps became cautious, and I could no longer walk with the same confidence. The further I walked, the more I felt as if I was invading an alien space, a place where there should be no people. Being alone in the forest is one thing. Being in a forest where everything changes, where you sense that there is something hidden behind every tree, is another. As I went deeper into the forest, the path became smaller and smaller, the leaves and branches almost completely obscuring it. It wasn't just a forest. It was a place that felt like it could suck you in if you stayed in it for too long. But I kept going. My curiosity and fear somehow combined, and I couldn't stop. When I reached the place where I had never been, the forest suddenly became silent. I heard no birds, no insects, no wind. There was only silence, strange, almost suffocating. Suddenly, I felt very cold. It was not an ordinary cold. It was a cold that you feel not on your skin, but in your body itself. I felt my muscles tense and my heart beat faster. I stopped, looking around. The trees that had seemed ordinary just a few minutes ago now began to seem like something alive, watching me. I felt their gaze, as if the forest was looking at me, trying to understand what I was doing here. And suddenly, at that moment, I realized something was wrong. Ahead of me lay an open clearing, and right in it sat a house. I froze. It was impossible. The house was perfect, just like in my childhood fantasies. Clean white paint, windows with light flickering through them, a beautiful blooming garden. None of it was there. It couldn't be real. How could a house be here so deep in the woods? I tried to make sense of it, but I couldn't. My body moved without my knowledge. I couldn't stop myself. I felt my heart squeeze as the door of the house creaked softly and opened. It was dark inside, but music was coming from there, a melody that made me move forward step by step. I stepped onto the porch. The door closed behind me, and I found myself inside the house. Darkness enveloped the room. Only a weak light from another room penetrated through the narrow windows. It was hard to breathe. The air was stale, but at the same time, strangely familiar. It was cold inside, but in this cold there was neither time nor place. Everything seemed timeless. I stood in the entryway, and although it was only a small house, it seemed endless. The walls seemed to stretch upward, and the room was filled with shadows, as if the walls themselves had a life of their own. The wind I had felt on the porch had suddenly disappeared, and there was no sound in the house except for a quiet melody that came from somewhere deep inside. The feeling of anxiety grew, but in a strange way I felt that if I did not move, something terrible could happen. I could not stay here alone, but I could not find the strength to leave this house. And despite all my uncertainty, I began to walk. My steps sounded too loud in the silence, echoing in the empty corridors. I didn't know what awaited me. A long staircase appeared before me, leading to the second floor. Each step seemed like a violation of something important, as if I was on the verge of entering a forbidden place. But I couldn't retreat. The melody coming from above became a little louder, as if it was calling me. I climbed the stairs, the creaking steps echoing, as if something invisible was watching my movements. Once I was on the top floor, everything became even stranger. The walls seemed to be getting closer, and the air was even thicker. I couldn't figure out what exactly was scaring me, but every move I made felt like I was breaking some ancient rules. I wasn't sure this was even a house anymore. It was some kind of space where there were no boundaries. Everything was mixed up, and now every step was important. The melody that was guiding me became brighter, more piercing. And then I came to the last door on the floor. It was closed, but it seemed familiar. I couldn't understand how that was possible. I didn't know what was behind it, but I felt inside that it was there, that the answer to all the questions that had arisen in me was hidden. I opened the door. The door. In front of me was a room that was unlike any other. It was bright with soft carpets and cozy furniture. But the strangest thing was that there was a photograph on the table in the middle. I came closer, and looking at it, I was overcome by a strange feeling. The photograph depicted a woman, but she seemed familiar to me. I couldn't understand where I knew her from, but this feeling of anxiety was taking hold of me more and more. In the background of the picture, part of this house was visible. It was the very corner where I had just stood. I felt the whole world around me changing. The walls began to move as if the house was a living being. I wanted to go back, but my legs wouldn't obey. Every step, every movement was forced by some invisible force. I couldn't understand what was happening. I couldn't leave. I was here, but at the same time I felt like I was somewhere else entirely. The melody that had been soft just a moment ago now sounded like voices whispering under their breath. I knew that these voices weren't just sounds. This was something much more real. And then I saw her again. The woman from the photograph appeared before me, as if coming out of the shadows. I couldn't understand how this was possible. My head was full of questions, but I couldn't find the answers. She looked at me. Her eyes, like dark abysses, pulled me towards her, and I knew that if I took a step towards her, I would not return. But I couldn't stop. Everything around me seemed so real that I wasn't sure it was just a dream. I tried to resist, but my legs kept moving towards her. The woman didn't move. She stood motionless, watching me. It seemed like everything I knew and felt was gradually disappearing. And at that moment, when I was already very close, her lips moved slightly, but I couldn't hear the words. Suddenly, something pulled me back. I jerked back as if someone had pushed me with an invisible force. The room began to disappear, and everything around me became dark, as if I were back in the forest. I was standing in a field, and the stars that I had not been able to see before suddenly began to shine brighter. But in front of me, between the trees, a shadow appeared again. The woman had disappeared, leaving only her image in my memory. I stood in the forest, and this forest now seemed completely different. There was something hidden, ominous around me, and I realized I will not leave this place the same again. When I found myself back in the forest, everything was different. The forest itself seemed to have changed, as if I had returned from a different time than I had entered before. The silence was the same, but it was not as calm as before. Now it was filled with anticipation, a tension I could not explain. Every step I took seemed too loud, as if I was disturbing something important that should not be disturbed. The leaves that had once been soft and crunchy under my feet now seemed hard and dry, and their rustling sounded ominous. I didn't know how much time had passed since I had entered the house. I couldn't understand how I had ended up in the forest and why it now seemed so alien. It seemed to me that I had lost my bearings, that the forest was no longer just space, but something much stranger, almost alive. I looked around, trying to figure out where to go, but all the paths and familiar ways looked distorted, as if the forest itself was adapting to me, changing its structure to confuse me. I took a deep breath, trying to pull myself together. My mind was desperately searching for an explanation for what was happening, but the more I tried to understand, the more ridiculous it all seemed. The whole situation was too confusing, and I felt like I couldn't get out. Everything that was connected to this forest became a part of me, a part of my consciousness. It was as if I was attached to this place, and this attachment, this connection, did not give me peace. Every tree in front of me seemed familiar, yet alien. I could have sworn I had seen them before, but they were different now. One of the trees had a strange, burnt surface that would not appear under normal conditions. It stood there, motionless, a silent witness to the fact that something unnatural was happening here. I started moving on, but the feeling that something was watching me did not leave me. I listened to every sound, every rustle, trying to understand where they were coming from. And then, at some point, I heard it, a weak, almost imperceptible rustle. It was almost the same as the one I heard in the house. It was not a sound perception, it was a strange internal response, something that you feel even without an obvious source. Instinctively, I froze, trying not to make a sound, and then I noticed him, on a small rise, a few steps away from me, sat a figure. It was hard to see in the darkness, but I couldn't be mistaken. It was the same man. This stranger who had appeared in my life many years ago was now before me again. His silhouette was indistinct. His outlines were lost in the shadows of the trees, but I knew it was him. He was the same as the day I first saw him. He sat motionless, his face hidden in shadow, but his eyes, I could feel them looking at me. They weren't human, they were empty, almost lifeless, but still full of some strange energy that made me feel vulnerable. I didn't know what to do. My mind was trying to find an answer to what was happening, but everything was becoming more and more strange and confusing. He was sitting there, as if waiting for something. I couldn't understand what he wanted from me. He didn't move, he didn't speak. He was like a statue, but I felt his presence on some deep level. I stepped forward, not daring to look at him. I felt something pushing me to move on, but I was afraid. I tried to walk away, but my legs wouldn't obey me, and I found myself getting closer and closer to him. When I was already very close, he suddenly raised his head. His eyes met mine, and in that moment I understood I should not have come here. This was not the place for me. It was not my time, and I was in the wrong place. This man, this stranger, he was not just a ghost, he was part of something bigger that I could not understand. There was no malice or hatred in his gaze. There was only silent condemnation, as if he knew that I should not have gone further. But I could not retreat. I could not go back. I knew that if I went, I would stay here forever, but if I stayed, I would also lose everything that was dear to me. At that moment, the forest changed again. The trees began to move, the shadows thickened, and I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to disappear. I tried to break free, but my legs wouldn't obey. The forest accepted me again, and I realized that everything that was happening was part of it, part of the world I had created for myself. It was a forest that knew me better than I knew myself, and now I had become part of it. I woke up in what felt like an instant. My gaze slid across the dark ceiling, and I, barely aware that I was in my own home, felt a strange uneasiness. It wasn't just lack of sleep or some kind of restless dream. It was the feeling that I was in another place, not in a dream, but in another, hidden space, in which I had once been. I turned over on my side, and everything around me returned to its usual rhythm. The room, despite its usual appearance, still seemed a little different. I felt that something had invisibly changed. The furniture was in its place. The light walls had not lost their usual shape, but the atmosphere had become different. Every sound, even the slightest, made me shudder unconsciously. I tried to get out of bed, but my body did not obey. I must have been too tired, and the remnants of sleep still constrained my movements. I looked at my watch. It was about 4 a.m, and for a while I just lay there, trying to figure out what was bothering me. But with each passing moment, the anxiety grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking nearby, something I couldn't see, but I could feel with every cell of my body. Maybe it was just a nightmare that had left traces behind. But with each passing moment, the doubts stretched to the point where I wasn't sure if it was just a dream. I got out of bed and walked carefully to the window. The outside world was covered in fog, and the light from the street lamps flickered through the thick, humid clouds. It seemed that everything was obscured by this mystical fog. I couldn't understand what exactly was happening at that moment. Everything looked strangely familiar, but I felt like I couldn't understand everything. I stepped into the hallway, and my gaze fell on an old cabinet standing in the corner. The cabinet was dark as a shadow and seemed to be part of the very space I could not decipher. There was no mirror in its doors, only light that dimly reflected off the ancient wood. I did not know what made me open it, but I felt that there was bound to be something in it. I did not know what exactly, but I knew that if I did not open it, it would torment me. When I opened the door, there was actually nothing inside except dust and old things. However, when I touched one of the objects, Everything around me shook. It was as if the world around me had shifted to another space again. The feeling was strange and eerie, as if I had stumbled upon something long forgotten that should not have been discovered. I took a step back, trying to shake off this strange feeling. I closed the cabinet, and the world around me returned to its usual reality. But the fear did not leave me. Something was wrong, and I felt that it was not just some inexplicable phenomenon. It was something much older and more powerful than I could have. My steps led me into the living room. I stopped at the door, but I didn't dare go in. I felt like I was being watched. I wasn't alone, but I couldn't see who or what was watching. The feeling was so strong that I found it hard to breathe. The whole atmosphere in the house became heavy, as if there was something hanging in the air that could disappear at any moment, but for now was hanging in the shadows. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know where to start. I decided I needed to check the house, look at every room, to calm myself down. But as I took a step forward, I suddenly heard it, a strange sound like a quiet, barely audible step. The same rustling I heard in the forest was now here, in my house. I froze, trying not to move. My heart was beating so loudly that I could barely hear anything but my own pulse. The rustling was getting closer. It was getting closer and closer. I didn't know what it was. Could it just be my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something real behind these strange sensations that had been haunting me since the moment I arrived in this house? Suddenly I knew I had to act, but I didn't know how. This wasn't just a ghost or some supernatural phenomenon. This was something alive that was following me, was part of me, part of this space I was in now, and I didn't know if I could get out. The shadows began to thicken again, and I felt the world around me becoming more and more alien and dangerous. The house was alive. It knew I was there, and now I was part of this strange, unknown world that was not going to let me go. I stood in the center of the living room, trying to regain control of my breathing, but the sensations wouldn't go away. It was as if I was trapped somewhere, where every step could sharpen my perception of something I hadn't been able to understand for a long time. I closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them, everything would return to its place. But as often happens in such situations, nothing changed. The world remained foggy and alien, as if it was subject to some will that I could not succumb to. The shadows in the corner of the room were shifting, and the same quiet footsteps I'd heard in the hallway were now more distinct. It was as if something or someone was moving in the darkness and I couldn't ignore it. The inability to explain what was happening only made the fear worse. It wasn't like ordinary fear. It was something more deeper, older, something that came from the very fabric of the house, as if the walls knew more than I did. I looked out the window again, but the darkness beyond the glass brought no relief. The fog obscured everything beyond my line of sight. There was no sound except my own breathing and the slight rustling that continued to come from somewhere in the dark corners. I realized that I couldn't just stay in this house. I needed to understand what was going on here, why I couldn't shake this feeling of being followed. The footsteps seemed to be approaching the door, but when I approached it with confidence, they suddenly stopped. It was a moment when something in the space became too heavy, when I began to feel that everything around me, every element, became unnaturally tense. I carefully opened the door and stepped into the dark corridor, peering intently at its end, trying to discern even the slightest movement. Suddenly it seemed that I caught something, a small shift in the shadows, barely noticeable but obvious. I walked further and further, passing familiar doors and furniture, but everything in this space felt alien. The feeling of being in another world grew stronger. Suddenly, when I reached the end of the hallway, I felt as if someone was standing right behind me. I froze and turned, but there was no one behind me. I felt even more vulnerable, as if all this was just the beginning, part of something much bigger that was just starting to play. I looked around the room I had entered and immediately noticed that there were old paintings hanging on the walls. This wasn't surprising. I had always known that these paintings were old, but now they seemed strangely alive, as if something was watching me from within these images. I took a step towards one of the paintings and immediately felt a strange, almost electric wave run through me. It was like a strange touch, but I couldn't quite place where it was coming from. And then I realized that I couldn't just leave here. I had to find an answer. I began to look around the room, moving along the walls. My hands were shaking slightly, and in every corner of the room there was something inexplicable. Everything seemed alive, but there was something frightening about it. My consciousness was lost, trying to comprehend what was happening, but it always returned to one thing. I was not alone here. I felt it not only physically, but also on a perceptual level, as if something was present in every cell of this space. I headed towards the old cabinet that stood in the corner. My hand tightened on the handle, and when I opened it, there was darkness in front of me, preventing me from seeing anything. The feeling that the cabinet was not just a storage place for things, but some kind of portal or passage became too strong. I didn't know what to expect, but it was already impossible to close it. Everything around me no longer obeyed ordinary logic. When I stepped into the depths of this space, it turned out that there, in the darkness, something was moving. I immediately felt how everything inside me was shrinking, and I was sure that I had to leave. But how can you leave a place where space changes before your eyes? where you cannot find clear boundaries of reality. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't leave either. What was happening wasn't just fear. It was something you wanted to forget, but that left you with only questions. And I knew that maybe this house wasn't just a place. It was part of something bigger. Something elusive was watching me, and I didn't know how long I would have to spend in this nightmare. Story 3. When I turned 18, my parents told me I had to leave home. Words I couldn't predict, couldn't prepare for. Sitting at the dinner table, I realized I wasn't staying in their house anymore. Nothing they said mattered. I had to leave. Just like that. At that moment, I felt fear. It was not the way I imagined it. Not the kind that tormented me when I was a child, and not the kind that made me hide under the blanket. No, this was the fear of an adult. The fear that now everything depended only on me, on my decisions, my actions. No one would protect me. No one would guide me. I was alone. I was already working at the local 7 to 11, and while the pay wasn't particularly great, I'd still saved up some money. It wasn't hundreds or thousands, but it was something. It was enough to rent a room in a cheap old house. This house was where adulthood began, and where I would learn to live on my own. I may have felt a little proud, but that pride quickly disappeared once I was faced with reality. The building I moved into was old, red brick, and uninviting. Like the house I grew up in, it wasn't exactly pretty. There were a lot of people just like me, trying to survive, filling every space in this utopian void. When I walked into my new room, I felt a cold air that immediately enveloped me. My belongings were minimal: a mattress, a chair, and a couple of cardboard boxes that contained things I thought were important, but in reality, they weren't. There was nothing in this room that made me feel comfortable or safe. I began to get used to this new life. Every morning when I woke up, I felt invisible. There was nothing personal, nothing to hold me back. I existed, but I didn't live. I worked in the store, came home, sometimes went out at night, walked the empty streets. Everything seemed gray and lifeless, but I tried not to think about it. I just did what needed to be done: work, survive. The facilities in the house were communal, and although all the people who lived there seemed strange and alien, over time I realized that we were all connected by one thread: the need to survive. We shared the kitchen, the toilets, the washing machines. Everyone had their own area, but no one violated the boundaries because no one wanted extra attention. We were all equally strange and equally needy. In the backyard, behind the house, there was a common garbage area. There were 2 large containers that were always overflowing. Every evening I took out the garbage, trying not to linger and not to look in the direction of these boxes. Garbage was a part of life. It was always there, and we all knew what to do with it, but we didn't always want to. This place was a black spot in our house, a part of which no one was proud. One day, while taking out the trash, I noticed that the shutters that usually closed off the area were open. This wasn't unusual, considering the building was old and a lot of things were broken. I thought maybe someone had simply forgotten to close them, but something was wrong. I walked up to the dumpster and noticed someone rummaging around inside. Was it that again? Homeless people trying to find food. But this person was different. He was moving strangely, unnaturally. He was chewing on something. It was hard to figure out what. At first I thought it might just be a person who had found food. Back then, a lot of people rummaged through dumpsters looking for discarded food. It was part of life, part of survival. But at that moment, something inside me stirred. I couldn't figure out what. I quickly left my trash on the ground and hurried away. I didn't want to be the one in the way. I didn't want to feel like an outsider, because we were all part of this mosaic, bound together by time, need, and desperation. But something about that moment made me feel ugly. I couldn't explain why it bothered me so much, but I couldn't forget it either. This man was like a shadow I couldn't shake. On my way home, I met Miriam. She was sitting on the stairs, holding her Pomeranian, Bella, and looking worried. She told me that her ex-husband had left the door open and the dog had escaped. There was a tense tone in her voice, but she tried not to show it. I felt her worry rub off on me. It was another moment when I felt that I was not alone in this world. We were all connected by the same fears and worries, despite living in different worlds. Miriam said she would look for Bella until the morning. I wanted to offer my help, but she refused, and I did not insist. Passing her, I returned to my apartment and closed the door. Thoughts about the garbage zone and the strange man were still spinning in my head, but I tried to distract myself. I took a joint, lit it, exhaled the smoke, but anxiety did not. The next day, I returned home late after work. My strength was running out, and I felt fatigue spreading throughout my body. As always, I entered through the back door that led to the common hallway and headed straight to my room. Miriam met me again on the stairs. She was sitting on the steps, the same Bella in her arms, but her gaze was dull, desperate. She didn't come back, she said without raising her head. I didn't know what to say. There was more than just weariness in her voice, but real pain, as if she had lost something important that she couldn't get back. I couldn't understand what exactly was behind her words, but at that moment I felt awkward, as if I was in the middle of her worries. There was nothing I could do to help, but I had to at least listen. The silence between us was heavy. I stood below her, and her gaze fell on me, as if she expected me to offer something comforting. But I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and went to my room. My thoughts were preoccupied with the whole evening, the garbage area, the man rummaging through the container, and that strange feeling I couldn't let go. Remembering how quickly I walked away from that strange sight, I relived that moment over and over again. Maybe it was something insignificant, just a ridiculous coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I could have just looked closer, but I didn't want to. This man, his movement, his chewing, it was all so strange and inhuman. It didn't fit into my understanding of the world. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the building. It was old, and the creaks and noises of the night that had gone unnoticed before were now clearly audible. I could hear someone stomping along the hallway, and the sound of the wind outside, and in that moment I realized that everything around me had become alien to me. This house had become my home, but it didn't feel as safe. The outside world now seemed more frightening and uncertain. I began to realize that this wasn't just a house, it was something more. It was like the core around which my whole life revolved. It was old and broken, just like me. We were the same, unwanted. The next day, after work, I went to take out the trash again. The weather was overcast, and the sky was covered with clouds. At some point, it even seemed to me that the whole world had condensed into this gray background, and I could not separate myself from it. Entering the yard, I slowed down, seeing a familiar picture. The shutters were open, as before. But now something was really strange. There were some strange things lying on the floor near the trash cans. A pack of paper, several plastic bags, shoelaces, and an old bucket. But the strangest thing was that among these objects there was a small toy. A plastic horse, as if from some old children's set. I did not know what to think. It was all so absurd and strange. I noticed again how much the smell had changed. It had become more pungent, and I felt sick. I didn't even want to go near the containers, but when I turned away to leave, my gaze fell on the garbage cans again. At that moment, I noticed that one of them was strangely ajar. The entire container was covered in a layer of dirt, and its lid was slightly raised, as if someone had recently been inside. I stood there, staring blankly at this garbage, and suddenly I realized that I had to take a look. There were too many strange things. I couldn't leave without finding out what was in there. My heart started beating faster as I got closer, and then I looked into the container. At that moment, I realized I had seen something horrific. What was there was nothing like the garbage I had expected. It was parts of something alive. Belches, crumpled and overturned bones, some clumps of fur. All of it was upside down and mixed up. And in the middle of it all, I noticed a dog collar. Bella. A name was engraved on the collar. It was all too real to be just a bad dream. I staggered back, my body unable to process what was happening at first. Shock, pain, and a strange emptiness inside. Could it be Bella, that little dog that was always by Miriam's side? How could this have happened? I felt panic rising in me. I couldn't understand what had happened or what I should do. At that moment, I became unbearably afraid. I couldn't stay here, couldn't continue down this path without any idea of what would happen next. But at that same moment, I knew I couldn't just leave. I had to figure it out. I stood in the darkness, staring at the dog collar, barely visible among the dirt and debris. My hands were shaking, and despite all the pain and shock, I couldn't tear my eyes away from what was in the trash can. I knew, of course, that maybe I shouldn't have gotten so involved. But in that moment, it felt like there was something more going on, something that wasn't just an accident. No matter how much I tried to justify my actions, I felt like I was part of something dark that shouldn't be touched. What was that collar for? Why were the body parts here, in a trash container? It seemed supernatural, unimaginable. But at the same time, I knew it couldn't be mystical. It was someone who did this. But who? I turned and walked quickly toward my apartment, anxiety coiling in my stomach and my thoughts jumping from one question to another. But on my way home, I felt like someone was watching me. I turned around abruptly, but behind me was only a dark, empty courtyard. This was an old neighborhood, and on nights like this, no one walked here. But the footsteps I heard weren't just the muffled sounds of the city at night. I was sure that someone was watching me. The black shadows in the corners of the building moved in their own rhythm, as if they were alive, and I forced myself to walk faster. This courtyard had become even darker than before. The walls of the buildings no longer seemed like simple structures, but something enormous, as if they could hide something much darker than the usual boring life that took place inside. When I opened the door to my apartment, I felt the air inside become heavy. It was as if someone had been sitting in my place for a minute, causing the space to seem to shrink. Everything inside was as it always was, but for some reason I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do something. I felt like I couldn't just close my eyes and forget what I had seen. My thoughts were still spinning around Bella, the collar, and what I had just discovered. I dropped my bag on the couch, wiped my palms on my pants, feeling the dampness of sweat, and looked out the window. The darkness of the night had once again swallowed the world outside the glass, and I felt uneasy, but I couldn't allow myself to sit in the dark and not think about what had happened. I pulled out my phone and dialed Miriam's number. My fingers slowed as I held the phone to my ear. I knew she would sound as worried as I did, but there was one important thing. If I told her what I had seen, would she believe me? Or would she think I was crazy? I didn't know how to approach this conversation, so I simply hung up, deciding to wait. Still, I couldn't back down. Bella was her favorite, and if the little dog really was dead, then maybe someone needed to be told. But what if this wasn't just animal murder? What if there was more to it? The thought became more and more intrusive with each passing hour. Then I decided to go back to the garbage zone. It was a strange and absurd decision, but I was drawn there as to something important that could not be left unfinished. I rode there on my old bike, and the closer I got, the more I felt the darkness thickening around me. Everything here matched the building, old and foggy, as if eternity itself had settled in these walls. When I arrived, I quickly looked into the dumpster. At first glance, there was nothing new, nothing that could surprise me. But suddenly I noticed that something had changed inside. The bin was empty. Everything I had left there earlier was gone, including the collar. This could not be an accident. And then I heard a rustling sound from behind, as if someone was nearby. But when I turned around, I saw nothing again. Only shadows that were not moving along the usual route, but as if with the purpose of pursuit. What was hiding in this place was not visible, but I clearly felt its presence. I turned quickly and walked back into the house without looking back. There was a fear in my heart that I couldn't shake. Miriam, Bella, something was wrong. There was no explanation that could take away the horror. I knew I wasn't just a part of something terrible. I was a witness to it. That evening passed in eerie silence. When I looked out the window again, I saw that the shadows on the street seemed longer than usual, and perhaps they were watching me. The next day, I woke up with a feeling of complete loss. My head was heavy with the thoughts of the night, and it seemed as if the whole world around me had become somewhat distorted. It was not just the feeling of not sleeping, but rather as if something invisible had touched my consciousness. A strange anxiety had been haunting me from the moment I returned home. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to Bella. The collar, its disappearance, that strange emptiness in the dumpster. It was all so foreign and inexplicable that I wanted to dismiss it as a bad dream. But I knew I couldn't forget. It had become a part of me. I was tied to what had happened, and it wouldn't let go until I figured it out. I was sure Miriam would notice how I avoided her gaze, how my behavior changed after I saw that horrible trace of the corpse. I didn't know how to explain my feelings to her, especially considering that I myself couldn't understand what exactly I was going through. I was afraid that if I told her, she simply wouldn't believe me. But on the other hand, I couldn't remain silent. Someone had to know that something terrible was happening in this house. I tried to take the usual route, heading to work at the store again. It had been unbearably quiet since the morning, as if the city itself had slowed down, as if listening, waiting for something. When I entered the store, I was greeted by the familiar smell of gasoline, sweet pastries, and the rest of the avalanche of everyday aromas. But this time, everything was somehow different. Even in these simple, everyday things, I felt alienated. As always, I saw familiar faces, people with whom I shared my everyday life. However, I noticed that many of them had become more silent, as if something was hanging on them too. Miriam had not come to work today, and I no longer felt her presence in these walls as before. Something had changed, but what? I could not concentrate on simple tasks. The cash register, the goods on the shelves, everything was as usual, but I had a persistent feeling that I no longer belonged here. After my shift, I felt that strange pull again. Something was pulling me back to that same yard. I couldn't understand why, but the feeling that I had to go back was too strong. I had no choice but to give in to that impulse and go outside. As soon as I found myself on the familiar street, the night fell upon me again with its heavy darkness. Everything was the same as last time, only now I felt it even more acutely. When I approached the garbage cans, I already knew that they would not be empty again. I could feel it, but when I opened one of the lids, I saw only ordinary garbage bags filling the space. Nothing out of the ordinary, but still, something was wrong. I couldn't believe my eyes. At first, I thought it was an empty bin, but then I noticed that inside, between the piles of garbage, there was a faint glint of something, and that glint was so familiar that I recognized it instantly. It was that collar, the same one I had seen before. I stood frozen in place, unable to take a step. Every sensation inside me told me that I should be here, that I shouldn't leave. My eyes darted quickly around the perimeter, and I felt how every corner of the yard became different. Time slowed down, and suddenly I heard light footsteps that weren't mine. The shadows began to move. I quickly turned around, but again saw nothing. Just a dark figure at the end of the yard, hiding in the darkness. No clear outlines, but the feeling of a presence was obvious. What was it? Who was it? Why was this shadow following me? I took a few steps back, but suddenly noticed something else moving in the depths of the dumpster. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward and grabbed the collar, pulling it out. It was dirty like everything else, but it was familiar. I immediately felt that its links were somehow especially cold, not like metal. It was strange. I put the collar back in the container, trying to calm my breathing. This couldn't be real. I tried to tell myself that these were just my imaginary fears, that I shouldn't worry about trivial things. But no, in that moment I was sure something was wrong. As I turned to leave, I saw a man emerge from the darkness, or what I thought was a man. His face was covered in something, black spots, as if he was part of the night. I felt my body paralyzed with fear. This couldn't be a man. He didn't move, didn't take a step. He just stood there and looked at me. My heart started beating faster, and without thinking I ran back to the house without looking back. I was sure that at that moment I was being followed. The morning was the same for me, but it felt completely different. I woke up in my room, but the feeling still didn't let go, as if everything I had experienced in the last few days was just the beginning of something bigger, something that couldn't go unnoticed. I didn't even want to get out of bed. The feeling that I had become a part of something I didn't understand was too overwhelming. I tried to forget what had happened in the yard. Those footsteps, That man, or was it a creature? Out of the darkness, with those eyes that couldn't belong to anyone alive. It was all too real to be a nightmare. I could still feel the chill that had coursed through my veins when I'd come face to face with that strange presence. But I couldn't think about it. I had to keep going if I wanted to retain any sanity. When I left the apartment, the first thing I did was head for the stairs. And then I noticed that it was quiet on all floors. Something unusual in the silence of this house made me slow down. I knew for sure that something was wrong, but I couldn't explain exactly what it was. A loud noise from the kitchen caught my attention and I walked towards it. I saw Miriam standing by the window. Her face was tense, and she was wiping something off the floor. I walked closer and noticed that there were some stains on the floor, dark and strange, as if someone had spilled something terrible. "Miriam, what happened?" I asked, but her eyes did not meet mine. She continued to wipe the floor, oblivious to my presence. "It doesn't matter," she replied, somewhat distantly. "I just wanted to go away. It's all so awful." I realized that something was wrong, but deciding not to insist, I started to leave. But something inside me told me that all this was somehow connected. Miriam had always been a rather calm and balanced woman, but her reaction today was not like her. It suggested that she was hiding something. My steps quickened, and I walked out of the kitchen to leave the house. I didn't know what to do, but I definitely couldn't stay here. Maybe this place was the cause of all these strange events. What if we were all just victims of something bigger, something we couldn't understand? When I went outside, I noticed that the air was strange. Nature looked the same as always. The sky was clear, and the street was quiet. But for some reason, it seemed to me that everything around me had become too threatening. Suddenly, I saw something strange standing at the end of the street, near an old abandoned building that I avoided visiting. It was a shadow, sliding between the empty windows, moving in time with my steps. I froze. My heart began to beat faster. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to go there. I was drawn to this place like an invisible force. Everything inside me was in confusion. I wanted to go back to my apartment and forget about this place. But no, this shadow, its movements, it was something important, something I couldn't ignore. As I got closer, I felt an unpleasant chill. However, I continued to move step by step, getting closer to the building. When I reached its walls, something inside me screamed, and I stopped again. And that was when I saw them. Several pairs of eyes, a gleam that looked like eyes. I could even feel them on me. They were looking at me from around the corner of the building. I wanted to retreat, but the steps behind me made me turn around. At that moment, the shadow rose, and I could no longer understand where reality ended and the nightmare began. I felt the blood drain from my body. My head was blurry and the air was unbearably heavy. At that moment, I felt small, helpless. I didn't know where to run, and worst of all, I wasn't sure I could go back. In that moment, as I turned back to the exit, I saw her, Miriam. She was standing on the other side of the street, her gaze deep and penetrating. There were no words, no screams. She just stood there and looked at me, and I felt that gaze penetrate my very soul. The dark emptiness inside me began to fill, and I realized that I was not, in fact, alone. Several days passed, but I could not get rid of the feeling of anxiety that settled inside. It seemed that something from the dark corners of this house or city was watching me, something that could not be explained by ordinary logic. Every time I passed by that building, I felt like something invisible was reaching out to me, forcing me to quicken my steps and look into every corner, into every shadow. Everything around me seemed to become part of some nightmare that did not want to let go. I didn't know why I decided to go back to that abandoned building. Maybe something inside me was pushing me to go back to where it all started, where I first felt that something was wrong. But when I got to that place, no matter how much I didn't want to, everything was completely different. The building looked like any other old structure, with peeling paint and broken windows. The only thing that caught my attention was an abandoned sign, barely visible among the dirt and dust. I stood in front of this building, feeling the gaze that was hidden in the shadows. For a few seconds, maybe minutes, I couldn't move. My entire body resisted taking the next step to go inside. And yet, an unknown force, or rather a curiosity that I could not control, made me take a step forward. The door opened with a barely audible creak, and I felt a chill that pierced me from head to toe. It was as if I had entered another dimension. Everything became strangely silent, as if every sound was muffled and the air was filled with heaviness. After walking a few steps, I saw a staircase leading to the basement. Intuitively, I knew that this place was the heart of what was happening. There was a tremor inside me, but step by step I went down. It felt like something invisible was watching my every move. The basement was dark, gloomy, full of old boxes and debris. There were streaks and marks on the walls that looked like time had stopped there. I didn't know what I was looking for, but my gut instinct told me I had to go further. Suddenly, I noticed a strange streak of light coming from one of the dark niches. It was unnatural. At first, I thought it might be a reflection, but as I got closer, the light became brighter and brighter. I felt my heart begin to pound wildly. With difficulty, I raised my hand to touch the source of light. And then I was struck by the terrible reality of what I had discovered. The light was coming from a mirror. It was built into the wall, and its surface was perfectly smooth, as if it had never been soiled by time. But something prevented me from looking into it. My eyes refused to look at the reflection. A feeling of horror overcame me when I realized that the mirror was not simply reflecting me, it seemed to be drawing my gaze. I took a step back, but as soon as I turned around, I felt my body become stiff. I tried to move, but I couldn't. The mirror suddenly showed not my reflection, but a shadow that was slowly emerging from its frame. It was something dark, creeping, that burst out of the depths of the mirror, as if from a forgotten world. My legs buckled, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature that began to crawl towards me, breaking out of the reflection. Its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed in the darkness, and there was nothing alive about its body. It moved slowly, as if it existed outside of time, and with each movement the air became heavier. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking, and all I could do was stare at this creature that kept moving towards me. It was like a nightmare that couldn't be woken up. Finally, at some point, I felt that I could not stand it any longer, and so, with incredible effort, I was able to tear my gaze away from this mirror. My mind began to crumble from the horror that I had experienced. As I turned to run out of the basement, the creature was finally gone. But one thing remained, the feeling that it was watching me. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears as I walked back up the stairs. I was sure that all this was not just an accident. This place did not leave me a chance to forget that I was a part of something terrible. There was only silence in the basement, but I knew that this was not the end. This was only the beginning. Every day I felt myself sinking deeper into this world, which had become alien and unfamiliar to me. It seemed that something had changed in me after that incident in the basement. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a bad feeling. The shadow of that creature, that look I had seen in the mirror, continued to follow me, invisible but tangible. I tried to lead a normal life. My work, the people I interacted with, it was all the same. However, every morning when I woke up, the feeling of not being alone returned. I no longer felt safe in my home. The shadow remained outside and inside. One evening after a long day at work, I returned to my apartment. It was dark inside. Only a dim lamp in the corner illuminated the space. I hadn't even turned on the main lights. As I sank into the silence, I noticed that something had changed in the room. On my desk, where there were usually only a few papers and magazines, lay an old, tattered notebook. I was sure I hadn't left it there. Trying to ignore it was impossible. Something about the notebook drew my attention, made me walk over and open it. When I turned the first page, I immediately realized that this was no ordinary journal. The writing was strange and disordered. The handwriting was sloppy, as if the author had written in a hurry, without stopping, without thinking about the outcome. The words overlapped each other, as if trying to record something important that was beyond their control. "They are watching me," it was written on the first page. Then came words I couldn't make out. "I can't, I don't know, they are watching, won't stop." All of this was accompanied by strange drawings resembling circles, lines, and closed figures. Suddenly I felt a cold air start to penetrate into my room, despite the closed windows. It was as if the room was filled with something that was not visible. I had the feeling that I was being watched. My heart sank in my chest, and I put the notebook down, trying to break free from this oppression. But as I turned to leave, I noticed again something I would rather not see. Dark spots had appeared on the walls, as if someone or something had been slowly painting them, making them brighter and brighter. The spots were exactly like the ones I had seen in the basement mirror. This wasn't just dust or dirt. This was something alive, something creeping, slowly filling the space, trying to surround me. I ran around the room, trying to turn on the lights, but the lamps weren't working. Something seemed to be wrong with the electricity, or with my head. I felt myself being sucked into the fog of anxiety again. I stood there, surrounded by a dark entity that wouldn't let me go. Everything I tried didn't help. I was back in a dark world from which I couldn't escape. This wasn't just a strange reality. It was something much deeper and more dangerous. I couldn't figure out where these feelings were coming from, this shadow I felt. But I knew one thing. This shadow wasn't just watching me. It was a part of me. I couldn't figure out when it all started, when I first became connected to this world. My entire inner world was destroyed. I didn't know how to live with this knowledge, with this power that was slowly and inexorably consuming me. But one thing became clear to me. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to find an answer, despite everything. But was it possible? Or was I already too far gone? I stood up, looked at the shadow on the wall, and realized that I couldn't escape what was waiting for me. I was doomed to be part of this shadow, part of something I couldn't even fully comprehend. But now it was too late. The shadow began to fill everything around me, consuming not only the space, but my soul. Story 4. When I look back, it seems like the internet was once a very different place. It was a different time, and even though I'm still young, I remember it the old internet. It's not the same as it is now. It's a crowded place, everything is instant, fragmented, and oversaturated. I remember how hard it was to find niche communities. It wasn't easy to find people who shared your interests, especially if you were into something less mainstream than the general internet population. So there I was, in my cozy corner of the world, looking for places where people would talk about whatever it was that interested me. I was looking for old forums where I could connect with someone on a deeper level, as opposed to the mosaic of TikTok and Reddit that exists today. This was an era when forums were still alive. They were angular and a bit old-fashioned, but that was what gave them their special atmosphere. I missed that time. There were no spam bots at every turn, and moderators often did their job honestly. But now everything seemed to have changed. Wherever I looked, most forums were either abandoned or littered with ads or pornographic links. It was disappointing, but I wanted to find something real, something that could bring back the feeling I had when I found such hidden corners of the internet back in the day. I spent hours browsing various sites. Most of them were either inactive or closed. Some seemed interesting at first glance, but turned out to be filled with spam or bots. With each passing day, my interest waned, and I almost gave up, thinking that such times were long gone. But then, on the third page of the forum sections, in a thread titled Sits, that remind me of the old internet of 2008, I came across a strange link. It was without any pretentious decorations, just plain and unremarkable. Ekpost, it said. I didn't think I'd find anything, but I clicked. When I landed on the site, my heart gave a sharp jolt. The design of the site was so old-fashioned that it seemed like a mistake. The background was gray and faded, with barely noticeable spots. Everything looked like the site was launched 10 years ago, but it was still functional. The page was almost empty, except for a couple of basic functions, posting private messages, user profiles. At the top was a banner saying that this was the most private forum on the internet. All around, it was empty and quiet, which further piqued my curiosity. I signed up and the process was slow, like the site was buried in the past and didn't want to wake up, but it was amazing. I was in there, and there were actually other people there. The posts were coming in at an enviable rate, and the comments felt alive. It wasn't spam. These were real people discussing different topics. The expectation that I would encounter toxic personalities or endless arguments didn't come true. All the discussions were relatively calm and reasonable. I felt special here. This was what I needed to find. The first few days on Echo Post were exciting. I participated in discussions, got to meet a few people, and it seemed like everyone who was there was looking for the same thing. This was a place for real conversation, not just empty posts or arguments. I even thought that this might be what I was missing on the internet. I was lucky to have found this place. In fact, I felt like I was one step ahead of everyone else because the site wasn't overcrowded. I could talk and be heard. In my life, where almost everything was happening so fast, this was a quiet place where I could relax. But soon everything changed. Night had fallen, and I was about to go to bed when my phone made a distinctive notification sound. I stretched, a little annoyed that someone had texted again. As much as I tried not to worry about such things, a sense of déjà vu suddenly overtook me when I opened the message. It was from a user named Jellyboy. His message contained no explanation, just a short comment. Damn, that sounds scary. My brows furrowed in confusion. I couldn't figure out what exactly was scary. I started scrolling back through the messages, trying to remember what I could have written or where I could have brought up some disturbing topic. But I couldn't find anything that would have caused such a reaction. With my fingers, I scrolled down the page until I came across the post in question. I think I just heard something outside my window. It could have been an animal or something. It keeps running around on the roof. My house is pretty old and the wood creaks a lot. I just hope it's a possum or something. The message read. The date was 12:03 p.m. April 3rd. I checked the time on my phone and my heart skipped a beat. It was 11:58 p.m. April 2nd. How was that possible? I was still in that time, but the post was published the next day. I looked at the screen twice, wondering if my head was going crazy. The time didn't match. Of course, I tried to convince myself that it was a mistake, that I had simply not noticed or mixed something up, but something was wrong. I closed my phone and tried to forget about it. I shouldn't worry. It's just a mistake or an accident. And yet, I feel a growing sense of unease. That night, I couldn't sleep because I heard strange sounds coming from outside the window. I woke up in the middle of the night from a creaking sound. It was a strange sound, heavy and metallic. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds continued. Sometimes it seemed as if they were coming from right under my window. Quiet, but distinct. I sat up in bed, listening. The creaking was repeated with regularity, as if someone who didn't know what they were doing was trying to climb onto the roof of my house. But at that moment, something began to feel uneasy. Why did these sounds return so persistently? I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe it was just a mouse or something like that. I decided it was time to check what was going on. I got out of bed, raised the blinds, and looked out the window. Darkness. Just an empty yard and old trees casting long shadows, but nothing strange or dangerous. I stood by the window, trying to figure out where that strange sound could be coming from. Maybe it was a tree swaying in the wind, but something didn't add up. My heart was beating faster. When I got back to bed, I was still feeling uneasy. I turned off the light and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. I must have been stressing too much about that weird forum post. All these thoughts were racing through my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but the same creaking noises kept coming in my head. I stood up again and went back to the window. The weather was clear. The stars were visible in the sky, but now there was a strange chill in the air. I watched the leaves on the trees sway, but the sounds that had disturbed me were gone. At that moment, I thought that maybe I was just imagining things. The window was closed, and maybe it was just an illusion. I closed it again and went back to my computer. As I sat down at my desk to try to distract myself, my phone pinged again. A message from that same Jellyboy. This user was the only one who wrote me such strange things. I opened it, even though I didn't want to. This time, the message was much more disturbing. Did you notice? You noticed that, didn't you? At first, I didn't understand what he meant, but then something clicked in my head. This message was strange. I scrolled through some of my old forum posts, trying to figure out what it was all about. Nothing came to mind. No weird phrases or abnormal references. I I felt goosebumps running down my skin. At that moment, of all things, I heard that creaking sound again. The creaking was sharp, almost metallic. It echoed through the house, as if someone outside was trying to climb onto the roof again. I froze, trying to figure out if it was in my head again. At that moment, I began to feel that the connection between the forum posts and this sound was becoming too obvious. Why? Why now? Why couldn't I shake the feeling that something was happening? I went to the window again, but this time I was alert, watching every little noise. The night was foggy, and the sky was covered with clouds. The whole world seemed to be in a fog, and the only thing I could hear was this persistent creaking, which now definitely came from outside. It was not my imagination. Unable to sit still any longer, I put on my jacket and went outside. There was a chill in the air, and the night was engulfed in fog, as if the whole world had become part of a dream. I didn't know what to expect, but my body was no longer obeying me. I walked to the side of the house where I usually didn't stand. There, among the old trees, I noticed movement. At that moment, my mind refused to believe what I was seeing. A figure appeared from behind a tree. It was something strange, tall, motionless, with a dark shell that hid its details. It stood against the background of trees and seemed strangely curved. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but something about its outline confused me. I stood there, unable to move. This feeling of fear and strange excitement came over me, as if I had encountered something that should not exist. Creatures from nightmares that I could not clearly see. Fear clenched in my chest, but I could not look away. It stood there, unmoving, but it seemed to be watching me. I took a step back, unable to watch any longer, and turned toward the house. The creaking sound echoed across the roof again. It was real, not a figment of my imagination. It was not normal, not just a random sound. I hurried back into the house and closed the door behind me. My phone vibrated again. There was a new message from Jelly Boy. Did you see him? Was he there? Did you see him? My heart was pounding. Something was wrong, and I felt this strange connection between the sight and what was happening outside growing stronger. I was unprepared for what I had just experienced, and thoughts that this might be more than just a coincidence crept into my mind again. There were no more questions. I understood one thing: I needed to find answers. My body was still shaking from what I had just experienced. I couldn't figure out what it was, but the feeling was too real to ignore. Standing in the dark room, I continued to stare at the screen of my phone, where Jelly Boy's disturbing words were reflected. He kept texting. Each message became more intrusive, as if he wasn't just watching me, but was a part of what was happening. I re-entered the section of the forum that the strange post had brought me to. My heart beat faster as I began to look through the other messages. It all seemed as if someone was trying to convey some kind of signs, to send me warnings that I couldn't understand. But now it didn't seem random. Every message, every word seemed deliberate, as if someone was watching me, anticipating my every move. And as if this someone was connected to the creature I had seen last night. A restless glance at the clock. It was midnight, and the silence in the house was becoming more and more oppressive. I thought about the messages from Jelly Boy. He always seemed to write late. Every word he said seemed to describe something I was going through or was about to go through. He knew what was going on, and the more I thought about it, the more real it became that it had something to do with that thing in the dark. I decided to do some investigating. To my great surprise, I found several posts on the forum from users who were writing about similar things. They were describing strange occurrences, creaking sounds, movements in the shadows, figures that appeared and disappeared without a trace. Finding myself among these stories, I realized that I was not alone. But what was strange was that none of these posts contained any details. People were talking about the same things I was: strange shadows, creaking sounds that should not be there. But no one could figure out what it was. And they all said the same thing: they could not get rid of the feeling that something or someone was watching them, and that they began to receive strange messages on the forums, like me. Unable to sit any longer, I went back to the window. The fog still hung over the land, hiding anything that might be hidden in its darkness. I saw the wind swaying the branches of the trees, but nothing was happening. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but when I looked out again, I saw the figure again. It was the same as before. She stood between the trees, as if merging with the shadows, but now I saw her move. Her silhouette was clear, and her movements were smooth, almost artificial. I knew this was not a figment of my imagination. This was real, and I knew I had to act. My heart was pounding, and I could barely feel my legs as I ran out of the house without realizing how it happened. It was cold, and I could hear my footsteps echoing in the foggy night. When I reached the place where I had seen the creature before, I stopped, not knowing what to do. Everything seemed strange and unnatural in this darkness. At that moment, something rustled in the darkness. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, and at that moment the thought came to me that I was no longer alone. I turned around and saw light shining through the trees. It was moving, approaching me. I felt my body fill with tension. It was impossible, but I couldn't look away. It wasn't just a person. It was something else. Panic gripped my chest. I wasn't ready for this. I started taking steps back, feeling the creature's every move as if it was watching me. The creaking started again, this time from the other side, as if it was surrounding me. It wasn't just fear. It was a sense of imminent danger. When I looked back in the direction the sound was coming from, I realized that the figure seemed to be moving not just because I saw something, but because it was moving toward me. At that moment, I felt my consciousness failing. My legs felt like wood, and the air felt heavy. I started running, not knowing where. All I wanted was to run away, but I felt like it was watching somewhere nearby. And the message from Jello Boy appeared in my head again. Did you notice it? Did you see it? Was it there? Every word echoed in my mind. My thoughts were confused, and I didn't know what was true and what was just my fears. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know where to run. At that moment, I heard that sound again, which had been haunting me all the time. But now it became louder, and I realized it was close. The fog was so thick that I could barely see where I was running. My steps were getting faster and faster, and every breath echoed in my chest like a loud, unbearable sound. I ran at random, not thinking about the direction, only about leaving this terrible place behind. But the further I went, the more I felt the darkness squeezing me into a ring, as if it itself had become a living being, ready to devour me. I couldn't see the creature anymore, but every time I looked around, I felt its presence. The creaking was coming from all directions now, moving as if it were trying to surround me. I tried to calm myself, to think logically, but panic filled my entire being. Everything in this place was alien and unreal. Time, space, everything seemed shaky, disturbed by some unknown influence. I looked back again. The same silhouette, or was it a shadow stretching to the edge of perception? With that question in my mind, I felt the air grow colder and something invisible pressing on my chest. It was as if someone invisible was standing right in front of me, looking into my eyes, making me freeze. I froze, feeling every hair on my body stand on end. How much time had passed since I left the house? Maybe it was only a few minutes, maybe a few hours. In the darkness, it made no difference. But then I felt something change in the air. The creaking sounds I had heard became more frequent, as if something was moving nearby. And suddenly, as if the answer to all my worries, I heard his voice, not human, but a low, almost inhuman sound. It was muffled, as if from underground, and I could not understand what exactly he was trying to convey. At that moment, my consciousness, already on the verge of a breakdown, began to forget what was real and what was an illusion. I hurried toward the nearest light, one of the street lamps. It glowed dimly, as if its light was obscured by something invisible. But I could see the light, and that gave me at least a little hope. I ran toward it, but something stopped me. My legs felt like they were going viscous, and I felt something cold touch my hand. My fingers tingled, and I felt a sense of desperate fear turn into unbearable anxiety. I turned and saw a shape emerge from the fog, but this time it was different. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze. It wasn't human. It was something bigger. It stood still, as if waiting for something. I could only make out a dark outline that blended into its surroundings. I tried to scream, but no words came out, as if the air was absorbing the sound, preventing it from escaping. I needed to leave, I knew it. I needed to run, to hide, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I tried to move, but I stood rooted to the spot. My heart was clenched with fear and despair, and I didn't know what to do. The force that held me in place was invisible, but tangible, and I realized that this creature was not just an observer, it was waiting for something, and I was the one who could give it an answer. I tried to move again, but more figures appeared before me, 2 more, and then more. Each of them was part of this nightmare, moving unnaturally quietly around me, hiding in the shadows. But there was no normality in their movements. They were like illusions, breaking up and becoming more real. Now I wasn't sure I could trust my eyes. The whole world around me was falling apart, and the fear was getting louder, like a real sound. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like everything around me was closing in. The walls of the invisible world were closing in, and I was just a part of it. I tried to take another step, but I couldn't anymore. I was in the center of this horror, and the only thing I could do was look at these creatures standing around me. It was then that I realized what had happened. These creatures, they weren't alien to me. They were something I didn't want to acknowledge, but something I'd known for a long time. They were part of what had surrounded me my entire life, and now they were coming for me. The creaks, the sounds, the shapes, they were all connected. And this wasn't just a nightmare. This was my own past, unleashed. I couldn't handle it. Fearing that they knew everything about me, I fell to my knees, unable to resist. The wait was so long and inevitable. I couldn't run away, and I didn't know what would happen next. Time continued to slip through my fingers, giving me no sense of reality. Each second became more and more drawn out, as if the silence itself was thickening around me. I felt the fear becoming dense, almost material, squeezing my body, as if I were drowning in this dark space. Everything around me seemed alien. The world I lived in began to collapse, and now I did not know what was true in it and what was just a reflection of this nightmare. I rose slowly to my feet, feeling the ground beneath my feet sway, as if it didn't know where it was either. And in that moment I saw them again. Those figures, ghostly as smoke, moving in time with the dark shadows. They weren't getting any closer, but I felt their presence so strongly that it seemed I couldn't get out of that ring of terror. I couldn't understand what they wanted from me. This was more than just observation. This was a real threat, not in the sense that they were going to attack me, but in the sense that their presence was something that constantly drained the strength from me. They didn't move a single step, didn't say a single word, but their silence was louder than any screams. And the more I looked at them, the more I felt the walls of my mind closing in. The misty shapes gradually became clearer. I could make out their faces, but they were strange, not human. The faces were more like masks than real features. Their eyes were dark, expressionless, as if they were not alive, but simply existing. I tried to step back, but my legs would not move. I was bound to this nightmare, and it would not let me go. I closed my eyes, trying to concentrate, trying to understand what was happening. But the more I tried to focus, the harder it became to distinguish what was real and what was my imagination. Every thought seemed distorted. These creatures, their eyes, their faces, everything was jumbled up in some nightmarish carousel. Then I felt something inside me tighten, as if my soul was trying to escape. I didn't know what it was, but I felt something changing. The creatures began to move. There was no haste in their movements, but each step was precisely measured, as if they were all moving in rhythm. I couldn't understand what it meant, but deep down I knew I couldn't stay in this place any longer. I took a step forward, but the air around me felt heavy, as if each step I took was slowed, as if I was being pulled back. I tried again, and at that moment one of the figures leaned slightly toward me. Its eyes were empty, and I felt a chill run down my skin. It was something unimaginable, something I could neither explain nor understand. But now I knew it was connected to this creature. It was connected to everything that was happening around me. Suddenly, I felt something awaken inside me. It was a feeling I had been trying to suppress all this time, but it now burst into my mind with great force. I began to realize that these beings were not just shadows. They were a part of me, and perhaps they had always been there. I was connected to them, as if my consciousness was a reflection of what I was trying to hide from myself. I stopped, realizing it, and that realization woke me up. Everything that was happening was part of my own fear. I wasn't just an observer, I was part of it. These beings were part of my soul, and maybe they weren't there to harm me, but to make me understand that they existed inside me. It wasn't evil, it was just a fear I didn't dare accept. I took another step forward, and suddenly everything was gone. The fog began to clear, the figures vanished into thin air, and I found myself alone again, standing in the empty silence. But I knew they were there, inside me. These creatures weren't evil, they were my fear, and now I realized I had to face it to understand that it couldn't destroy me. My life went on, despite it, and now I was ready to embrace my shadow. I sat in a dark room, frozen in absolute silence, staring at my phone. There was a vague uneasiness in my head, but I kept reading anyway. The messages I was receiving were strange, drawing me deeper and deeper into something I couldn't understand. Their number was growing, and I knew something important was about to happen. All of these messages were connected, and I was beginning to realize that I couldn't escape what was happening. The time on my phone screen was out of sync with reality again, and it was starting to make me anxious. The posts kept coming, more and more alarming, but I couldn't tear myself away from them. I put the phone down on the table, and just when I decided I needed to calm down, I heard footsteps. They were quiet, almost inaudible, but I knew they were coming. I stood up, listening, but the sounds disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. The sense of urgency and menace did not leave me. I stepped towards the door, tried to open it, but it was locked. I squeezed the handle, but it didn't budge. Suddenly, I felt the space around me shrink, the walls too close, and I couldn't find a way out. And again, a new message appeared. I picked up the phone again. My fingers were shaking, but I kept reading, knowing that there was some truth hidden there that I had to understand. I felt the tension building inside me, and with each new message, I felt everything around me become even more unclear. My body was frozen and my mind was trying to put everything in its place, but all I felt was confusion and fear. The posts kept coming, but they were plunging me deeper into the abyss. I didn't know what was real and what wasn't. Everything around me was becoming one big nightmare, and I didn't know how to get out of it. Each new notification made me feel even more helpless. Time became more and more strange, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I tried to ignore the fear that was gradually taking over me, but it was impossible. I looked out the window again, and in the darkness, in the shadows, I saw a shadowy figure. It was too much. I couldn't stand it anymore. The sound of footsteps. I quickly turned around, but saw no one. Silence. But the footsteps continued to sound in my head, like something that could not disappear. I picked up my phone again. The posts continued to update, and I saw them describing my every move. Every moment of my stay in this place, in this house, was recorded. And this was not just a prediction, it was a warning. The moment I realized that this was no accident, that this site, this forum, was some kind of portal connecting me to something terrible, I felt my strength begin to leave me. Fear became real, and the walls became too close. Each message became a harbinger of what was happening around me, and I knew I couldn't leave. Story 5. I will never forget the day my world changed. Even though it happened when I was a child, the feeling of fear still haunts me. It's hard to explain what exactly happened. I can't call it an encounter with some supernatural being, but what I saw still sends shivers down my spine. Even now, when I think about it, my chest tightens, and the feeling doesn't go away. It haunts me like a shadow that can't be driven away. I was still little that day, but already old enough to understand that not everything in this world can be explained by the usual laws. We lived in an old house on the outskirts of the city. It was spacious but terrifying in its antiquity, as if time had frozen in every room. The doors creaked, and the floors were covered with carpets that crumpled with every step. The house seemed alive, and I often felt like it was watching us, especially at night. And oddly enough, it became especially strange at night. The night in that house was different. You couldn't hear the sounds of the street, You couldn't hear the wind whistling outside the windows. The house was absolutely silent, and this silence weighed on me. I often woke up at night and couldn't fall asleep for a long time, feeling that something or someone might be nearby. But I didn't know that one day this feeling would grow into something real. That night I woke up as always in the silence. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the outlines of objects in the room. At that moment I couldn't say exactly what had caught my attention. It just seemed like something was wrong. I turned my head toward the window, as if an inner voice had forced me to do so. And there, in the moonlight, I saw him. He was standing by the window, but it was not clear how he had gotten there. He was tall, his figure was dimly visible, as if hidden in shadow, but I felt his gaze riveted on me. I had no doubt I had not seen this man before. He was a stranger to this house, a stranger to my life. But that was not the most terrible thing. His face, it was inhuman. The lines of his face seemed blurred, as if his features were constantly changing, merging and blurring, but his gaze remained alive, sharp and piercing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him even if I wanted to. In that moment, it seemed like I had become part of something bigger. That gaze pierced me through and through, penetrating my very soul. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't move, I couldn't even blink. How long did I stand there, not knowing what to do? Maybe a minute, maybe an hour. Time loses all meaning in such moments. When I finally decided to close my eyes and turn around to go back to bed, it seemed to me that the figure at the window had come a little closer, but I was not sure. I quickly turned away and could not fall asleep for a long time, although the feeling of anxiety did not leave me until the morning. The next few days brought no relief. I tried to forget about it, but every morning when I woke up, I felt my heart beat faster and my breathing become labored, as if I were reliving that moment again. I looked around the house, but everything was the same. Nothing had changed. And yet the feeling became more and more real with each passing day. Over time, I began to notice strange things. First, I saw the man more often. He was no longer standing by the window, but I felt his presence in other places. Sometimes I would wake up in the night and find him in the most unexpected places, as if he were watching me. He was in the corner of the room, in the doorway, by the stairs, never too close, but always somewhere nearby, just out of sight. I tried to talk to someone about it, but no one took my words seriously. My parents thought I was just afraid of the dark. They tried to calm me down, saying that these were just my fears, and that I should learn to sleep in my room, but I couldn't. My fear was real, and it wouldn't go away no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Every day I became more and more nervous, withdrawn. I stopped walking around the house unless someone was around, and I avoided night walks. Even if I was at the other end of the house, it seemed to me that something was watching me, that I was not alone. And this person or creature was always nearby. It wasn't normal, and I knew that sooner or later I would have to figure out what was going on, but I never found an answer. This strange experience became a part of my life, and every time I returned to that house, I knew that it was still there, and maybe it was still watching me to this day. From the moment I encountered what was happening in the house, my life changed. It was no longer just a home. The place became unbearably alien, and its walls seemed to absorb everything I felt. I often woke up at night and couldn't figure out if I was back on that night when I saw him at the window, or if this was some new nightmare. But the fear remained. It seemed to me that the house was becoming more and more gloomy with each passing day. It seemed that even the light in it was growing dimmer. I began to notice that every time I entered a room, the air was heavier and the space was compressed. Sometimes I heard footsteps when I was alone. The noise of footsteps, the gait of a person, but when I looked around the room, there was no one. At such moments, my heart began to beat faster. I was not sure if I was really hearing it, but those steps were too real. I decided to start looking for an explanation. That week I went up to the attic again, hoping to find something that would give me some kind of clue. Taking a flashlight and walking along the dusty shelves, I noticed an old box sitting in the corner. I had never seen it before, and it was clearly hidden from view. Opening the box, I found old documents and books. One of them was a handwritten note with illegible scribbles. When I tried to read it, I felt uneasy. It spoke of an ancient cult and rituals that had been performed in this house many years ago, but whether it was real or just a figment of my imagination, I didn't know. After I closed the box, I felt a presence, not like before, not the feeling of a figure at the window. This was something else. It was as if something invisible was watching me, standing behind me. I looked around, but there was no one in the room. However, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The next day, I decided to talk to the neighbors, hoping to learn more about the house and its past. One of them, an old man who had lived on the street the longest, looked at me with concern when I mentioned the name of the house. He said that the house had been empty for a long time, and everyone who tried to live there soon left. There was talk of something strange connected with the house, but no one wanted to talk about the details. He said that he had heard about it when he was young. Even he felt uneasy when he passed by. When I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that every step I took left a mark. Every day, it became more and more difficult for me to distinguish reality from what I could imagine. It was as if the house made me doubt myself, my perceptions. That night, I woke up again to strange sounds. They were footsteps, but they weren't quite like usual. Not the usual footsteps on wood or the noise of someone walking on old boards. These footsteps were wrong. Something about them seemed out of character, like someone was there, but moving strangely, slowly, as if they were watching me. I got out of bed and walked carefully down the hallway. My breathing became even and quiet, and each step echoed in the empty rooms. I approached the room where I had heard the footsteps and opened the door. There, in a dark corner, stood a figure, barely visible in the dim light of the moon. It was not a person, and not just a shadow. It was like a ghost, shifting between light and shadow, its outlines changing and blurring. But the most terrifying thing was that the figure moved. It did not stand still, as it once had, but walked around the room moving silently, as if it were part of the house. I couldn't believe my eyes. This couldn't be real, but I could feel my body starting to get cold. I felt that familiar fear again, the one that had been tormenting me since that night at the window, and now it was here, in my house. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, and my mind couldn't comprehend what was happening. Then the figure disappeared into the shadows, as if it had dissolved, and I was alone again. I don't know how long I stood in that room. When I returned to my bed, I had no peace. I just lay there and thought about what I had seen. But one thing was clear. I was not alone in that house. After I saw the figure in the room, the nights in the house became unbearable. Every day I felt the sense of something unfamiliar and dangerous growing. At night I couldn't sleep. Anxiety squeezed my chest, and the shadows seemed to become deeper and thicker. Even when I tried to close my eyes, it seemed to me that someone was watching me from the dark corners of my room. I could never forget that strange silhouette, that look that seemed to penetrate straight into my soul. I decided I needed to figure out what was going on. I couldn't just ignore the strange things going on around me anymore. Every morning I woke up with the feeling that something was different, but I couldn't figure out what it was. But the house was getting scarier. The external signs were getting worse. A cold that couldn't be explained, the creaking of old boards, as if something was moving heavily across the floors when no one was around. And then one day I came to a decision. I needed to know the history of this house. If I could solve its mystery, maybe I could stop what was happening. I started looking for information in the library, asking old-timers of the city. All my attempts came up against a dead end. Everyone I tried to talk to didn't want to talk about it. They were avoidant, restless, as if the topic was taboo. Several older people even advised me to move, but no one explained why. I didn't give up. Then I went to one of the oldest villagers, the same old man who had spoken of the house the last time. He was old, but his eyes were still clear despite his age. When I asked him about the house, his face immediately became gloomy. He looked at me as if I were an idiot, and then said, "You better forget about it. What you're looking for will bring you more trouble than you can imagine." I asked him persistently what he meant. He was silent for a few minutes, and then, as if in thought, he began to tell his story. The house, he said, had been built many years ago before he was born, and the stories about it were almost as old in the town. He spoke of how people had lived here before, who had behaved strangely, as if they had lost something, and then disappeared without a trace. They had not spoken of it openly, but the old man remembered one thing that made him shudder. Those who had once lived in this house were connected to a cult that worshipped ancient powers, unknown and frightening, and that performed rituals in the dungeons of the house. When I asked what the rituals were, his face grew even paler, and he looked at me as if I had violated something. He warned me not to look for anything in the house because something that has been awakened lives there. He said it was best to leave before it was too late, but he seemed hesitant to give me more information. I felt like his words left me with more questions than answers. Late that night, when I returned home, I sat in the dark, unsure of what to do. The old man's words haunted me, but one thing was clear: the house was not just old. It held something more. I couldn't shake the thought that the mysterious figure I had seen was not just a coincidence. It was part of something vast, connected to the history of this place. That night, I was again awakened by a strange sound coming from the basement. It was a quiet but distinct knocking, as if someone was tapping on the wooden walls. It was not just an echo of the wind or a random noise. No, it was some kind of conscious, purposeful sound. I jumped out of bed and went down the stairs, towards the basement, as if I did not want to believe what was happening. When I got down, I stopped for a few seconds at the door. The silence was absolute. But inside me there was no doubt, no fear. It was an intuition telling me that I had to go in. I opened the basement door and the frost pierced me. The cold was unusual, not just the cold of the air, but as if the earth itself held an ancient frost within itself. I turned on the flashlight and carefully entered the basement. But even with this small source of light, I was scared. Dark corners, old wooden beams, and cobwebs, all this created an eerie atmosphere. I walked through the basement, trying not to think about what could be hiding in its depths. In one corner of the basement, I noticed strange signs on the walls, carved with some kind of sharp instrument. They weren't just drawings, they resembled ancient symbols I'd seen in books when I read about old cultures and religions. I didn't know what it meant, but it was clearly related to the cult the old man was talking about. As I turned to leave, I felt something. It wasn't just a presence, it was something real, like someone was standing right next to me. I froze, trying to figure out what was going on, and then out of the darkness, right in the corner, a voice came. It was quiet, but clear. "You came too late," he said. My heart fluttered and I froze. It was not the old man's voice, nor was it someone I knew. It was a strange, cold voice that I had never heard before. I felt something taking hold of me and I wanted to run away, but I couldn't. I was hypnotized, but before I could take a single step, everything around me went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I didn't immediately realize where I was. Everything was dark, but it was different, thick as fabric. I was sitting on a cold concrete floor, and the air was heavy and damp. My heart was beating fast, and my head was in complete chaos. I felt the ground beneath me sway slightly, as if I were in some other dimension, a space where time and place no longer mattered. Reaching out to the walls, I felt their rough surface. It was the same basement, but now it looked different. Everything seemed distorted, and every object in this place was filled with a strange energy, as if invisible signals were floating in the air. I tried to stand up, but my legs refused to obey, as if I were tied to the floor. Then I realized that I could not move. It was as if invisible hands were holding me, and I felt some force begin to penetrate me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone. The shadow that had been watching me was now standing right in front of me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, its gaze. It was alien, cold, and penetrating. It wasn't just an observation, it was a sense that something was trying to understand me, as if it were reading my darkest fears and desires. With an effort, I opened my eyes, trying to see something in this absolute darkness. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of me, slowly materializing from the dark shadows. It was not quite human. The face was indistinct, its outlines were changing, and its shape was blurred, like a ghost or an illusion. It was something that was beyond human understanding, but one thing was clear, it was not benevolent. "You came here," the voice whispered, sending a chill down my spine. "You came looking for answers, and now you know you're not alone." The creature's words echoed through my mind, and I realized that this house was more than just an abandoned place. It was connected to something far older than I could have imagined. This was not a place for humans. This was a place where long-forgotten forces had been awakened, and they were now seeking a way to return to our world. I tried to move, but my arms and legs felt like they were tied, and I felt this entity penetrating my mind. It was not limited to physical reality. It penetrated every cell of my body, every thought, distorting reality. "This is your destiny," the voice continued. "You have been chosen. You are part of this ritual. You will never leave here until you have fulfilled your role." With each word, the voice grew louder and clearer, as if it were trying to swallow me up completely. I tried to understand what he meant, but I couldn't find an answer. My head was in such chaos that I could barely think. And that's when I realized that I was standing in front of something much more dangerous than I could have imagined. This wasn't just a house with mysterious happenings. It was a trap, and I was part of it. All those strange footsteps, voices, figures, even the cold I felt, all of this was part of something that had been happening here for centuries. The entity approached me, and I felt its presence fill the entire space. I tried to break free, but I couldn't. My soul, my will, all of it was absorbed by what stood before me. Then, I heard another voice, more familiar and quiet, but still loud and clear in that darkness. It was the voice of the old man who had spoken to me the day before. "I don't listen to him," he said, his words like a warning. "You shouldn't be here." And that's when I realized that this wasn't just a random moment. It was a continuation of a chain of events that I may have triggered myself. But I didn't know how to get out. I didn't know how to escape what was being prepared, or how to escape my role in this ancient and sinister game. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing: I couldn't stay here. This place was dark, not just physically, but on a deeper level. It was like it was pulling me in, not letting me escape, and I felt like it was becoming a part of me. My attempts to move were futile. I was tied to this space, and every time I tried to break free, it only tightened around me, as if I had become part of its very essence. I knew this was not just a house. It was much more. It was a place where distorted realities intertwined, where time and space lost their meaning. Then I heard that voice again. It was cold and piercing, as if from the very heart of darkness. "You will not leave," it whispered. It was not a threat, it was a statement. The entity before me knew that I could not leave this place alive, and perhaps it had already decided my fate. But at that moment, something changed. The old man's voice that I had heard before sounded again, but now his words were brighter, as if he were nearby. "You must choose. You must free yourself from what holds you here. You must destroy what you have awakened." I felt the dark forces closing in around me, but at the same time a fire ignited inside me. The thought flashed through my mind like a bolt of lightning: I will not be part of this. I will not be part of them. I had to act. All I knew was that I had to leave, and I had a chance. The thought began to work in my head that I needed to find the source of this power. I knew that if I could destroy what had drawn these entities into this world, I could free myself. I tried to stand up again, but this time my legs moved. Each step was like a struggle with unknown forces, but I knew I only had one chance. I walked out of the basement and was greeted by an eerie silence, sad and oppressive. The house seemed to be holding its breath, as if it knew what I was about to do. I ran through the hallways, past the same rooms that had seemed so familiar before, but now they were empty, as if time itself had slowed down here. I ran towards the very room where I had once seen the silhouette. There was something there that I had not noticed before, strange symbols that were carved into the walls. They were not just drawings, they were something important. I realized that these signs were a key, that they were part of what kept me in this house. I leaned against the wall to examine them more closely. The symbols seemed ancient, as if they had been carved with stone tools. They weren't just there on the surface, there was dark magic in their lines and curves. They were connected to what had awakened in this house. I could feel the energy of these symbols seeping into me, like a chill seeping into my bones. I knew I had to destroy them. I didn't know how, but something in my gut told me that if I destroyed these symbols, I could break free. I picked up the nearest object, an old metal crowbar that was lying on a shelf. I hit the wall hard, and the iron responded with a surprisingly loud sound. With each blow, with each symbol destroyed, I felt the power in this house weaken. It was as if the darkness itself was retreating, as if I was breaking its chains. But it was clear that this was not the end. I fought the dark force I was confronting not only physically, but also with my soul. I understood that this house was not just walls and ceilings. It was part of something huge, and its destruction required not just strength, but also determination. And then, when the last symbol was destroyed, the house went silent. Everything around me became quieter. The darkness that filled the space became less dense. I felt a weight lift from me, as if I had finally been freed from some invisible presence. I didn't know if it was the end or just the beginning of a new challenge, but at that moment I knew one thing: I had survived. I had taken a step towards freedom. Now I could leave.